Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we have a very exciting mod. You see, a big issue with the Vampire Coast is that a human, that of Aranessa Saltspite, was turned into a undead faction, taking control of Sartosa, which is a well-known pirate city, and yeah, undead pirates, it works, but they should be living. Sartosa is a pirate nation and should be represented as such. So this mod, Nanu's Pirates of Sartosa Overhaul, you might remember this from Warhammer 2, has finally released in Warhammer 3, and it makes it just that. There's a lot to talk about, and let's just jump right in. There's a lot of changes coming into effect. The first here in the technology tree, you can see that the pseudo-legendary lords for the Vampire Coast have been replaced. Here you have, in fact, 4 pseudo-legendary lords. These are mortal, and 4 pseudo-legendary heroes too. There's a few more, but you will notice that the tech tree also has been updated. We have a massive roster now, which we'll talk about in a little second, so every tech here does also update the units that you may have. As when you go to the building tab, you will notice a lot of new units. Keep in mind, you will still also recruit the undead units. This is something that I guess the modder hasn't figured out how to replace. It's the whole thing with the sub-faction stuff being so new. But you can easily ignore the undead and just work with a normal human roster. There is a lot of units. It's basically a whole new roster worth of stuff with loads of different shooting units and anti-large pirates and even some artillery too. So you've got access to a lot. You don't have to worry about if you don't use the undead, will you be missing out on anything, barring, well, pretty much a lot of units with fear and terror because monsters and undead. Shipbuilding has also been updated, and you'll get some humans here too. You still have a lot of undead stuff, but don't you worry, as empire building with the Vampire Coast isn't too tough, and here you'll be able to get like the Dwarf Buccaneers, or even some Northman Raiders. It depends on what you want from this. Mind you, mostly just use this to reduce the upkeep of my armies because, yeah. Events normally tied to the Vampire Coast have been changed around when you're playing as Aranessa, where instead of being able to pick a gunnery right or a Mongol and so on, you've got actions here to be able to pick one of your 4 new generic heroes. Yes, there's quite a lot of them. And there's other special events too, like for example, this custom quest battle. Yeah, you heard me correctly, which allows you to get another legendary lord that takes you up to 6 legendary lords, including Aranessa, into your faction, and this is Jago Roth. We'll talk about him a little bit later on, but the fact that you get a custom quest battle for it is actually really interesting. I didn't know something like that was possible. I'm not sure if this was something that we saw in Warhammer 2 at all. Anyways, you do have a new generic lord option known as the Sartosa Fleet Admiral, and what this is just if you want to focus around humans, and it just kind of makes sense. It's an interesting character. You start off as a melee character, but then you can boost it up. Well, melee hybrid, but then you can make it into a rifle unit because you have a weapon option skill, which I think is freaking cool. And it focuses around boosting up your troops. You got a decent amount of abilities here. And yeah, you can just focus around just having living armies, which is very thematic, especially when it comes to the fact that Sartosa should be a living place. Right, let's talk about the custom quest battles. So this one's the one to unlock Jago Roth. Unfortunately, at this very moment, it is bugged, but don't you worry, you'll still get Jago Roth. And yeah, it's an interesting concept. I guess it's something that's being worked on, and I guess this is new for Warhammer 3, that people are able to make custom quest battles. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But yeah, I like the idea that this is going to be actually possible now. And it shows promise, not just for this mod, but like mods all around. So I'm kind of content. It's just a shame that the battle itself didn't work. The enemy just didn't spawn for some reason. Just leaving the battle after you start it will just end it, and you'll get Jago Roth, so then you'll be able to recruit him. And he has the following traits. Keep in mind that he is the mastermind of the Grand Alliance. Dreadfleet players will remember this. So, diplomatic relations minus 200 with the Dreadfleet. You're going to face the wrath of Count Noctilus. Has access to shipbuilding, weapon strength plus 20% when fighting against Vampire Counts, Vampire Coast, and Tomb Kings for Lord's Army, missile damage plus 20% when fighting against Vampire Counts, Vampire Coast, and Tomb Kings Lord's Army, melee attack plus 6 for Privateer units Lord's Army, melee defense plus 6, Privateer units Lord's Army, these are new units, immune to psychology for Privateer units Lord's Army. Recruitment costs plus 200% for all undead units in Lord's Army, and upkeep plus 200% for all undead units Lord's Army. So you're going to have to think ahead if you actually want the undead or not. And you're going to need extra coffers if you do, but you don't really need the undead, believe me. I've done a little time with this mod, and yeah, you don't need the undead. The way I describe Jago Roth is mostly a buffer. Like, he's got a lot of skills that could improve his damage output to anyone else and diplomatic relations with other living factions, but yeah, if you want to buff up your troops and make them absolutely terrifying, this works out quite well. He's also pretty good in doing damage, so yeah, can't really complain. And you can get magical attacks with your army. The idea is making your army extremely potent, and he does it really, really well. So he's got access to shipbuilding, as you can imagine, and he's got access to some special buildings that he can build, which will give him a lot more bombardment abilities. That's kind of expected, to be able to do a lot more damage. It's so you can have variety. I think all the new legendary lords for this mod just have something special about them here, and I think that kind of works out really well, as that means that you can get different playstyles out of it. You can see a lot of interesting things, like for example, when you start looking towards one of the legendary heroes, this is Benny Redbeard, and has the following effects. Obviously, he gets wounded instead of killed. Enemy hero action success chance -5% for enemy characters in region. Weapon strength plus 10% for Sartosa pirates, privateers, and ogre units in hero's army. And missile damage plus 10% for Sartosa pirates, privateer, and ogre units in hero's army. The character itself is a buffer, so you want these legendary heroes in armies rather than just being heroes, but then again, most heroes you just kind of want in armies anyway, and you can just buff them up to boost up your troops and have them as support heroes. They're also pretty good at doing damage by their own right, so it actually kind of works out quite well. You'll get 4 in total, which we'll be covering all of them as we progress through this video. It works if you want to put them all with one legendary lord. It will make a lord very powerful, but I kind of recommend just splitting them up a little bit. The next legendary hero is Stinky Pete, which has the following effects. Again, he won't die, he'll get wounded. Number of uses +1 for all abilities, these are all the special ones. Melee damage plus 10% for Buccaneer units, all armies faction-wide. And missile damage plus 10% for all Sartosan cannons and mortar crews, all armies faction-wide. He is quite the powerful dwarf. This character is already what you're already used to with the dwarf, so you'll boost up the range capabilities of your troops, also your own, but also get a bunch of abilities to be able to do a lot of damage on enemies or even augment your own troops. So there's a lot there to play around with, and yeah, very useful if you decide to go full dwarf army. The next legendary hero is a Norskin this time with Harik the Blooded, and his effects are as follows. Control -5 for local enemy province, recruit rank +2 for all Norskin units in Hero's army, and upkeep -25% for Norskin units in Hero's army. You do have a lot to play with, and having some Norskins can work out quite well, as they are fairly strong, I'd say. So if you want to have a Norskin themed army, best to have the hero there, and then just boost up the capabilities as you go from there. So the character itself has a bunch of skills, as you can imagine, which focus up on making it very melee focused. So this is if you want a proper melee focused army, and you can boost up all the capabilities of your Norskins. There's quite a lot there, especially if you want to do some extra damage against the Warriors of Chaos, Demons, and even Norska. This is the character that you want in an army if you're going up north to the Northern Wastes. And the last legendary hero, as you can see there's quite a lot of them, is the High Prophet of Manaan. Keep in mind, by the way, that these are the ones that you recruit with Infamy. And his custom effects are as follows. Number of uses +1 for Summon Prometheans, Winds of Magic cost -4 for Summon Prometheans, and upkeep -25% for living Promethean and Leviathan units in Hero's army. So you're going to get quite a lot from here. So the character himself is a spellcaster, which means that you'll have access to this new lore of magic known as the Lore of Manaan, which is very similar to the Lore of the Deeps anyway, and yeah, you can do a lot. He's fairly weak at the beginning. I count him as a very warrior priest-like type of character until you start getting the mounts. When the mounts start coming into effect, the Promethean or the Leviathan, the character will be much better, as he'll be much tankier, so you can keep him up front doing damage. But early on, you want to keep him away, as yeah, he cannot take a few hits. So we're going to move on to the pseudo-legendary lords, and this is where things get a little bit different, as, again, they are recruited with Infamy, and they're very different to what you're already used to when it comes to the Vampire Coast, as each of them are very heavily specialized, and I think that adds in a lot of flavor. So the first one itself will be a Notorious Admiral. This is James Ashley, and the effects are as follows. Income from post-battle loot +15% for Lord's Army. Income from raiding +15% for Lord's Army. Has access to shipbuilding and has a special chain. Diplomatic relations -30 with Southern Realms, but by the time that you start getting these characters, the Southern Realms will mostly be destroyed. recruit rank +2 for all Sartosan pirate units, Lord's Army, and income from sacking Southern Kingdom settlements +25% for Lord's Army. It depends, sometimes they'll be alive, but in most cases they'll be dead. So again, a unique building line when it comes to the shipbuilding, and you've got the standard one to get the Sufbar 42-pounder, but then you've got another one which kind of focuses on doing another bombardment. You're going to get a lot of these bombardment abilities with the pseudo-lords, and it works out quite well as it makes you feel like you're running a Black Ark, essentially. Just a very highly mobile one that can move on land too. Skill-wise, he'll focus heavily on privateers, and yeah, it just depends on how you want to play. You don't have to, you can just mix and match as you please, as these characters are more than able to. But in general, the damage output is just generally quite high. You'll also get the ability to reduce the upkeep for all your undead. But again, you won't need it. Trust me, you won't need it. The second pseudo-lord is an interesting character, Jenny. She's got the following benefits. Diplomatic relations -50 with the Dark Elves. Casualties captured post-battle +30% for Lord's Army. Control -6 for local enemy province. Has access to shipbuilding, unique chain. Recruitment -1 turn for Death Guard units, minimum of 1 turn for Lord's Army. And causes terror when fighting against the Dark Elves. So yes, this is an undead character. You can use undead here, and you have access to a Friends of the Living units. But in general, very different, and you can play around, as you can already see. She's got access to a mix of spells, mostly focusing around the lore of vampires, a few of the lore of death, and something from the lore of the deeps. So you can play around with this character quite well, I'd say. It's a character that, it just changes things up a little bit. She's got the hunger, she's got a few little bits and bobs over there. It's interesting to have a character that's so focused against fighting the undead. So if you want to actually go to Noggerond and you want to deal with Malekith, or you want to deal with Morathi and so on, you've got something that's very stylized here, and I think that adds in a lot of flavor for something like that. Plus, it gives you a reason to actually use the undead units. So yeah, I mean, it's not a bad thing. This is why you keep them there. And yeah, I like it. I think it's different, and it just adds a little bit of variety at least, because there are still vampire pirates in Sartosa, just they're not the majority. The third pseudo-lord is Sammy the Snake, and he has the following benefits. Enemy hero action success chance -5% for enemy characters in region. Trade resources produced +10% faction-wide. Again, shipbuilding and special chain. Income from ports +10% faction-wide. Upkeep -25% for smuggler and saboteur units for Lord's Army. And diplomatic relations -50 for the court of Liberas, which, interesting. But anyways, this character is focused heavily on trade, as you can imagine, and he's your economy-based lord. With this, you can see that he doesn't have any magic. He does have a lot of abilities. He's got Friend of the Dead too, if you want to use undead units too. But his unique skill line, because they all have unique skill lines near the end at the first one where Monkey Jacket is, it'll just go past Forager into that. It'll focus very heavily on economy boosting, which is kind of needed. You can also boost up the capabilities of certain troops, but the idea is just getting more cash and more cash and more cash. You'll take a while to be able to get this character, but it does really help, especially when you're focusing on just expanding if you're trying to build up an actual empire, which you should with the Vampire Coast. You're very able to, and you should with Sartosa. You are, again, very able to. And lastly, we have Davy Redeye, who's a Beastmaster, and his effects are as follows. Bonus versus large, +6 for Lord's Army. Shipbuilding and building chain, once again, for unique stuff. The income from sacking Lizardmen settlements, +25% for Lord's Army. Abilities, Hunter's Snare. Recruit rank, +3 for all monsters in Lord's Army. And diplomatic relations, -40 with the Lizardmen. So already, you're going to notice some difference here. This is another undead character, by the way, as you can already tell, who's got access to some Lord of the Deep stuff. He's got access to some spells from the Lord of Vampires too. And yeah, overall, it gives you variety. It makes sure that all of them are so drastically different. This is another buffer type character, but he buffs on monsters, so you'll be able to take advantage of a lot of monster units overall. If you want to just go undead again, it's fine. But this one's like, think Rakaf. Yeah, think Undead Rakaf, essentially, where you get access to a bunch of different things. You can play around with the shipbuilding too, which will give you access to a bunch of undead units, including undead Dreadsaurians too, which I think is kind of fun. So yeah, you've got a lot of variety there, and I think that just adds in a lot of flavor. So now we're going to start moving on to the generic heroes, because you do have access to 4 of them, the first one being the Dwarf Powder Cook, and this one kind of works like a Dwarf Engineer, so it boosts up the capabilities of your range units, whilst also making them quite potent to be able to do damage. You've got access to weapon options too, so as you level up, you'll start to get them, and it changes how the hero works in battle. This is something that I really hope that we get in vanilla. But yeah, so the next one after that is the Sartosa Fleet Captain. So this is just a captain, again, can buff up your units, but also there to do some damage. It's a melee-based character, well, kind of like a hybrid. So you get a lot of options, and you can just play around, and I think this is kind of cool. I like these hybrid characters, as it just adds in a little bit more for your actual playstyle, for what you want to do. The heroes themselves will be kind of similar. They can all establish coves, by the way, but very different at the same time, because it just focuses on different aspects, while Sartosa is very much the same. Same thing goes with the Norska Reven Captain, as you can tell. It just kind of adds in a little bit more, so you can just play around. And since you've got like loads of mini rosters within this big roster, it just is nice to be able to focus on, oh, I want to go full Norscan, so I might as well have a Norscan army and a Norscan Reven Captain with me, as you can see from all the effects of his skills that are on screen right now. And lastly, the Priest of Manaan gives you access to the spells of Manaan. This is a custom spell lore, and it's just kind of cool because this means that you have access to some spells, and you don't have to focus on the Lore of the Deeps if you don't want to. It's just, you know, a living one to have some living spells. Again, theming, very, very important. It's a decent spell lore. I think it's pretty good overall, and it's nice just to have a little bit of extra flavor. You can get them on Prometheans too, which make them a lot tankier. They're decent without it, but it's just better to have them mounted. Aranessa's had a few changes to her effects, so let's just talk about it. For the faction effects, we got Diplomatic Relations minus 100 with Norska. A lot of them will remain the same, by the way. Chance of finding treasure maps plus 25%, income from raiding plus 50%, income from sacking settlements plus 20%. Then, with the Lord effects, Loyalty plus 2 for Sartosa Fleet Admirals, yes, loyalty is still a thing. Character Aura Leadership effect plus 12, Melee Attack plus 8 for all Sartosan units and Lord's Army, Weapon Strength plus 20% for Sartosan units and Lord's Army, Recruitment Duration minus 1%, I think that's 1 turn, I'm not too sure, for living Promethean and Leviathan units to a minimum of 1 turn, Ability Frenzy for living Prometheans and Leviathans, and lastly a negative here, upkeep plus 50% for Norscan units and Lord's Army. Keep in mind that Aranessa absolutely hates the Norskans because they were, well, not nice to her, let's just put it that way. And as you can tell, the roster's absolutely huge. I didn't expect this video to be that massive, but then again, you have to take into account that there's so many things being implemented. So as you can tell here, loads and loads of units. You still have access to all the undead, like I said before, but you know, it's nice to have the variety, and obviously since you have different characters, different lords, you can still recruit the standard lord choices too if you want to have undead armies, but it's all completely up to you, and I think that works out quite well. It's also important to note that you will still be spreading undead corruption. Anyways, this is your new generic lord option, decent all around. Keep in mind he doesn't have access to any magic, unlike the undead versions, but, you know, he's still able to do a lot. Good stats, able to be an anti-infantry unit, he's got armor-piercing missiles, he can fire whilst moving, so if you want a skirmishing army, you've got it over here, and I think it works out quite well overall. You'll start having access to different heroes too, so like for example, these are the Dwarf Powder Cooks, and as you can see, there's loads of different weapon types, so you can drastically change their abilities as you just change the weapon, and I love this. It's again something I really want on like vanilla and base game, just have different weapon options. I think that would just be absolutely amazing. All the hero options, unit options, and all that just look really, really good. And yeah, I mean, you've got another one here with the Norscan Reaver Captain, which you've got a Mongol Chariot. I kind of like that. You've also got a Neon Wolf Pet. Like, this is a known bug in vanilla too, where things are just way too shiny. So I'm imagining that that needs to get fixed out in vanilla before it can get fixed out in the mods. It's pretty interesting. Like, in general, it's a good character. It's very heavily armored. It can do a lot of damage. It's purely melee focused, but it does the job. It does the job. And lastly, the Priest of Manaan, like I said, you've got access to some new spells that you can play around with, and like I said, the Promethean is probably the best thing about it. Once you can get it like tanky, you can take it up in front, it can cast spells in the front line without having to worry too much. It's just so much better once you actually start to use it. Never mind, I forgot about the Sartosa Privateer Captain. So this is a hybrid character in the sense of its skill. So you can either have it with a ranged weapon or with a halberd, so either range and armor piercing or anti-large, and it works out quite well. Again, it's just nice to have this thing. I love the fact of just being able to switch weapons. It's such a cool thing. Really, it's so cool because it really reminds me of the tabletop. Alright, so we're going to start going into the units now. We got the Norscan Whalers, anti-large, very basic in terms of stats, but then again, this is kind of like a low-tier unit, essentially. Well, yeah, overall, it's kind of good. They've got aquatic. A lot of your guys have access to aquatic, so you're going to be able to move around marshes really, really easily, and it kind of makes sense for a pirate to be able to do so. And some of them have got special abilities, like, for example, Perfect Vigor, which, yeah, again, makes sense. Overall, stats are very, very good, and it's just depending on how you play around with them. Okay, we've got Norscan Reavers here, and these are more of a high-tier unit. Keep in mind that Aranessa will have increased upkeep for them, so you're going to have to use them with other characters unless you can do it with the money. So there's 3 different variants here. There's the Berserkers, anti-infantry, you know, dual weapons, always really, really good, especially when you're dealing with hordes. And since you're going to be dealing with a lot of Undead and a lot of Skaven, yeah, you know, it's going to be useful. Second one is halberds, and the last one is sword and board, the usual stuff. High tier stats. Overall, it's very similar to that. Well, it's carbon copy essentially of that of the Marauder Champions, just with an additional type of weapon. And yeah, overall, very, very good. You're going to want to use these. You're going to want to use these with other armies, especially if you can get that Norscan character in and just theme it with that and go attack Norska. It just kind of adds to some extra damage, and yeah, I'm a big fan of this. I'm a big fan of seeing so many variants in a minor type of roster within the main roster as it stands. It's very interesting. Kind of like what I want from the Dogs of War, essentially, if they ever get added in officially. You got 2 variants of basic Norskans, one with great weapons and the other one with just sword and board. Again, aquatic too. Keep in mind that aquatic does kind of change things up a little bit, especially if you're fighting on island battles, which kind of become common as you're traveling around, seeing as those pirate factions will start trying to aim for you. But in general, it's just nice to have, and it's low tier, so these are the early ones that you'll get. Just adds a little bit of extra flavor just to be able to, you know, have a little bit more. Plus, again, variety for the sake of variety, which is always cool. Dwarf Buccaneers will be your basic dwarf unit, so you've got a lot there. You know, it's a damage dealer dwarf, not a lot of armor, but then again, they're pirates, not really heavily armored dwarfs. They can be fast for a dwarf. They've got frenzy, they've got pistol weapons too, so yeah, they're a skirmishing type unit. I think that works out quite well for them. And you've got access to 2 melee versions of the privateers. Yeah, keep in mind that we're focusing on the melee versions first. So this is one with halberds, so anti-large, and the second variant, which will show up in a bit, is dual weapons. And yeah, armored, anti-infantry, damage dealer. The other one is armor-piercing, anti-large. So you've got the variety there, and they look freaking cool. Again, big, important thing. Cool factor for me is just so important. I think they look really nice. It's just, makes me hope that in the future we'll see a proper Sartosan faction, you know? And lastly, you got the Sartosan pirates with halberds. So yeah, this is a lower tier unit, but higher tier in a sense, because you can use it for a different thing. So it's anti-large, armor-piercing. It's got Vanguard deployment, which I think is quite good. In all, it's a flanker for the big monsters, and yeah, I mean, if you're dealing with big monsters, these can be quite useful. I like them, I just haven't really used them too much. So you're going to have access to weapons teams too, and there's 3 of them, right? And these are the Buccaneers with the Drake gun, the torpedo weapon, and the deck gun too. So if you're used to playing as the Vampire Coast already, Skaven, and even the Dwarfs, you already know how you're going to be able to use these. It's just nice to have some variety, and obviously it makes sense for the dwarfs in your roster to have all the weapons teams because, you know, they're dwarfs and this is what they do best. All in all, yeah, pretty good units. Loads of damage output. They're very similar to that of the stuff that you've already got available in the Undead version, and I think that's perfectly fine. It's just have access to something that you just don't have access to normally, right? We've got Dwarf Buccaneers here with handguns, so yeah, I mean, not great range overall, but a decent amount of damage. The idea is just to have a lot of variety. You do get a pretty high missile strength for what I would say for a dwarf, at least for a pirate dwarf. They're close quarters missile infantry too, so you want them up there just hitting the flanks. And yeah, I mean, I'm happy. I quite like these. I did have a dwarf theme army when I was playing around, which was kind of cool. On the range section, you do have another version of the privateer. This is armored. They're armor-piercing missiles. They can fire on the move too, and it's just to have a bit of extra firepower coming in. I like these. I really like these units. They're good stats all around, I'd say, and they really do provide a decent front line in case you don't want to use the ones with the halberds. A healthy mix of both is obviously very useful though. Sartosan saboteurs are quite interesting, so they can fire whilst moving, special range weapon. It's essentially just a big blunderbuss, but yeah, I quite like them. Where it's more like a grenade type weapon, but you know what I mean. It's the idea of having something different. The fact that they can stalk and fire whilst moving is quite interesting. Stalking will allow them to get into the enemy flanks a little bit better. So in general, yeah, very useful. It's nice that you have so many different types of units that are just so varied. Sartosan saboteurs are quite interesting, so they can fire whilst moving, special range weapon. It's essentially just a big blunderbuss, but yeah, I quite like them. Where it's more like a grenade type weapon, but you know what I mean. It's the idea of having something different. The fact that they can stalk and fire whilst moving is quite interesting. Stalking will allow them to get into the enemy flanks a little bit better. So in general, yeah, very useful. It's nice that you have so many different types of units that are just so varied. And then lastly, Sartosan pirates. These are with handguns, and these are your gunline. The fact that they can also vanguard too is tasty. It's very tasty. Depending on the map, you can spawn like right in front of your enemy and just shoot them out directly. Obviously with enough buffs to make these units quite potent, because early on they're not going to be that strong. But it's kind of hilarious when that happens, as you can delete armies very well, but you need a lot of bonuses. Alright, so now you're going to have access to a bunch of artillery, which you've already got used to, well, barring the flame cannon, which is more just for the dwarves, but it's just to have more, you know, living artillery pieces. You've got a cannon, you've got mortars, you've got a flame cannon, which is going to be very useful if you're dealing with loads of hordes, and you might be, considering, well, you can trust travel anywhere with a Vampire Coast. That's the great thing about that faction. You've also got access to a new Regiment of Renown, which kind of replaces Queen Bess, which is known as the Hullbreaker. All in all, you have a lot of stuff. And hell, like, we're not even properly done yet. It's the idea of just having this massive roster to play around with. It's so nice. It's honestly so nice. Then you've got a bunch of living variants of the beasties, so obviously like the Warhounds, the Prometheans, and the Leviathan. The Warhounds are just the Norscan Warhounds. And after that, if you go for the special ones, you've got the zombie dragon and stuff like that, which will show up later on this video. I just want to take this time to just say my thoughts regarding this mod. This is an absolute reason to play as Sartosa. It's just so great to have an option to play as living stuff. I know a lot of people have just kind of like, yeah, you know, we've got the Vampire Coast, we don't really need Sartosa, but it's just so nice to have that option. The options with this series is a great thing, and I really hope we get a proper Sartosan faction in the future. Either way, this mod, you can find it in the description below. I would honestly recommend trying it out. If you need a reason to try something different, this is a complete overhaul. It's just so cool. You still have access to the undead units. Try it as a challenge not to use undead units unless you've got the undead pseudo-legendary lords, and just try and play as human as possible. You're going to really like this, or at least I have. But anyways, with all that being said, let me know what you think about the mod in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. Until then, I shall see you all again very soon. Have a good day.